Greetings, A-Push Nation. This is the last of our spring break lectures. That's going to be on video. It's 1920s politics and the Great Depression. Remember, the good news is we only need to cover about the first 8 pages up to the Great Depression. I think I said causes in class. You need to go all the way through the Great Depression, all the way up to the Great Depression. So, without further ado, let's get started. And of course, we've got the presidents of the 1920s here. Although not in their exact order, it would appear. Oh, I guess they are. Harding, who looks like one of the Muppet characters, Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. All right, let's get started. 1920s politics, prosperity, and depression. So, of course, the Republican administrations of the 1920s were very conservative. They were very pro-business. They believed in a focus on economic power here instead of allowing other countries' companies to come into our country. They're old guard conservatives. They believe in high tariffs, protecting American businesses. Government does whatever it can to do so. Very conservative, reduce taxes on the rich, conservative social policies, not a lot of change in society. They're going to really oppose progressivism, for instance. This is awesome. This is a great chart we're going to refer to a bunch of different times. What do liberals and progressives generally believe? They believe the government should regulate business. They believe the federal government is the key to improving human beings' lives. So the federal government has the power, the wealth, the ability to actually improve the lives of people more than any other organization in the world. They also believe in graduated income taxes, lower tariffs, things that they believe will benefit the lower classes, the working classes. Meanwhile, conservatives believe in laissez, faire, which again means the government stays out of business or does not regulate business. They believe in the idea of rugged individualism, that you're an individual, you go out and you make yourself or you break yourself on your own. You don't have anybody else really to blame except for yourself. If you achieve great things in life, you get to reap the benefits and enjoy that. If not, well, you really don't have anybody to complain to, and nobody's going to bail you out. They don't believe in handouts. They don't believe in government assistance. They believe that you rely on your family, your friends, your charities, your churches. You don't rely on the government for that sort of assistance. They also believe in states' rights, conservatives do. Remember, they believe the states should have as much authority as possible that's not given to the federal government in the Constitution. They want states making decisions. They think states better are able to solve the issues within their area instead of one federal government law that has to apply to all 50 states. The problem is, if a state doesn't want to respect the rights of people or enforce certain laws, it doesn't have to. And if the federal government's not strong, it can't force that state to follow the law. Also, of course, conservatives believe in lower taxes, right? They believe in less taxes because they want the government to be smaller and less involved in your life, so they want it to have less money. They believe in high tariffs to protect American businesses. Anything to protect American businesses. That also means working against unions and workers who are going to fight for higher wages and things like that. They're going to cost businesses money. So look at this. Interesting how this happens here. In 1920s, well, first off, liberals and progressives, those included both Republicans like Roosevelt and Democrats like Wilson, up until 1920, up until really about the 1920s. Then what happens is this idea becomes squarely just a Democratic idea. So the Republicans who were progressives move away and either became Democrats, formed third parties, or became more conservative over time and jumped over to the Republican Party. Meanwhile, old guard Republicans, the Republicans of the Gilded Age in the 1920s, they supported this conservative idea, this mindset, and then really all the way up until today, Republicans have continued to maintain these conservative ideals. They tend to fight for these ideas as opposed to these. So this is the major fight in politics in the 20s, in the 30s, and moving forward all the way up till today. So you ask when we start to shift? The answer is we start to shift now. And look at this. I think this is maybe the most fascinating part. By the way, conservatives tend to fight for more moral, religious reforms as well, whereas liberals tend to fight for more civil rights. Look at how we've gone back and forth. From 1900 to 1920, it was liberal progressives, whether they were Democrat or Republican. Now we're into the 1920s, we're going to notice it's very conservative. And look at this spectrum. It shows you how liberal they were. If they're way over here, that means they're amongst the most radical or liberal presidencies we've ever had in terms of the power they gave to the federal government. If they're over here, that means they're amongst the most conservative governments we've had who supported those ideas and enforced them more vigorously. So again, number one here, the progressives, they were about there on the chart. They were liberal, they were progressive, but they were kind of moderately progressive. Meanwhile, look at who takes over now. Hardcore old guard conservatives. And then notice what happens as we go through the rest of the 20th century. We're going to get through each of these eras, but do you notice how we go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? Now check this out, right? We get to 2008, that's Barack Obama, 2 terms. Which means now we've gone back again after Obama's presidency, back to Republican control. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Anyways, who were they between 1900 and 1932? Well, Democrats, remember, in the early 1900s were the working class. They were immigrants affected by political machines, Catholics, populists like farmers, and of course Southern whites, the Solid South. Those were the groups that made up the Democrats. Republicans during this era, who made them up? Middle class and upper class Americans, white Protestants, and African Americans who supported the Republican Party up until 1932. Because, of course, they were never going to support the Democrats, who were the openly racist and segregationist party. What about now, after 1932? What do we see change? Well, Democrats today are going to be the working class still, and now African Americans, they jump from the Republican Party over to the Democrats. Latinos, which are a larger group than ever, women, intellectuals, people with higher education tend to be Democrats, gays and lesbians. Republicans, middle and upper class still, white males still, evangelicals, right, born-again Christians, Christian conservatives, white Southerners. You notice they've switched over. When African Americans jump to the Democratic side, then the white Southerners move over to the Republican side rather than be associated with the African Americans. Let's get to that point. Let's see why those things happen. So we go to 1920. I think I already covered this election in previous slides, but whatever. Warren Harding is your candidate. He was ambiguous. He didn't really explain his platform very well. What he did was he promised America a return to normalcy. Normalcy to him was conservatism. We're going to go back to our conservative, isolationist roots again. So we're going to adopt conservative policies like we did during the Gilded Age. We're going to go back to being isolationist. We're going to go back to turning this country, making this country normal again, back to how it used to be and how it's supposed to operate. He argues that progressivism and the World War involvement and the imperialism were a change from what made America great, and he wants to return us back to normalcy. By this time, the conservatives, the old guard wing of the Republican Party, dominates. They have absolute control, and so they're nominating their candidates, and Harding most definitely is one of them. The Democrats nominated a guy named James Cox. He did have FDR as his running mate. Gosh, they look alike. He promised, hey, we're gonna join the League of Nations. We're going to continue a lot of Wilson's progressive policies. The nation's tired of progressivism. They're tired of the war. They want to change. And Harding wins convincingly, in a landslide. Women did vote for the first time in this election. They didn't have a huge effect on the outcome. Eugene Debs was in jail during this election. He had been jailed because of the Sedition Act, where he had spoken out against the war. Even though he's in jail, he received 6% of the vote as president. Republicans really turned the election into a mandate. They argued if we win, and we win convincingly, that proves the American public doesn't want to join the League, and so we're not going to join the League, we're not going to join the treaty, and we're going to become very conservative again. That happened. Look at this. Only the Solid South voted for Cox. The remainder of the country voted Republican. Warren Harding, there he is. Warren Harding, there he goes. First thing we need to know about Harding is he was dominated by his cabinet. Now, he had some really effective cabinet leaders. He had a great Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes, who negotiated a number of important conferences, which we'll get to when we get to foreign policy of the 20s back at school again. Andrew Mellon, one of the most famous secretaries of the Treasury ever. He lowered the debt. He lowered taxes for the wealthy. He believed lowering taxes for the wealthy would be a trigger, a spark, that would lead greater jobs and more wealth and wages for all Americans. There is Coolidge, the vice president, Herbert Hoover, who is going to be the next president after them, and then Andrew Mellon in between. Andrew Mellon very much controlled controlled the monetary, the treasury policy. He basically determined how the economy would function during this time. By the way, he was a super rich corporatist who had made his money in metals. Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce, probably the most famous, the most popular. He was considered a progressive. He did want some reforms to improve society. He did believe that we could still reform businesses and have them cooperate with the government so that both government and businesses would benefit. He didn't believe you had to break up all businesses just to kind of regulate them. He had already made a reputation for himself by helping flood victims in the Mississippi flood of 1927, where he had led efforts to help folks to rescue them and to get them back on their feet again. But however, despite these kind of capable guys, the cabinet was dominated by Republican old guard friends of Harding. In fact, they referred to his cabinet sometimes as the Ohio Gang because it was filled with a bunch of his old buddies from Ohio, maybe not the most skilled cabinet members, guys that had been chosen because they were businessmen, because they were loyal to him, and because maybe they were close poker buddies and friends. Anyways, very much a McKinley-like administration. His administration didn't believe in regulation, so the government didn't regulate businesses, and that meant a lot of businesses cut corners, cheated, were kind of corrupt and greedy. They made tons of money, but they oftentimes engaged in corruption and bribery. And his administration was scandal-prone. But the good thing for him, I guess you could say, is none of these scandals had really become public up until he died. And he died towards the end of his first term. So we believe the stress from these scandals and trying to cover him up and all that probably contributed to his death. The biggest one was called Teapot Dome. It occurred in a place called Teapot Dome, Wyoming. It was where oil reserves that had been set aside for the Navy, if they ever needed them in an emergency, were secretly sold to private companies who then took the oil and profited from it themselves. The agenda of the 20s. This is Harding and Coolidge and Hoover. These guys all believed in the same philosophy. The role of government is to make business profitable, to do whatever you could to make businesses profitable. That meant you cut taxes on the wealthy, on corporations, so that they had more money to spend to build their business, to make it grow, to hire more workers. Again, this was put forth by Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, who himself was a very wealthy corporatist. They believed tax cuts would result in more investment by the owner in the company. That would create more jobs. That means the wealth, the benefits would trickle down like rain does to the rest of society. It would hit the wealthiest people first with tax cuts, and then the benefits of that would trickle down to the rest of us in the middle and lower classes as time went by. The problem, of course, is that we cut taxes on the wealthy. That means we increase taxes a lot of times on the middle class to make up for the lost tax revenue. This is a good example of that. You can see kind of how over time during this era, we are noticing, we should start to see changes in the tax policy that demonstrate these changes. Let's move it on to higher tariffs as well. The second part of the Republican strategy, the conservative strategy, was incredibly high tariffs to protect American businesses, remembering that many of the government leaders themselves were the businessmen who would benefit the most. Businesses feared a lot of cheap competition from Europe, especially after the war, because Europe was rebuilding. So we raised that tariff rate up again to 38%. We also raised tariffs on farm produce from overseas to protect our farmers. Europe was just really hurt by this. They struggled to recover from the war now that they couldn't sell their products in the United States as well. They struggled to pay back their debts to the U.S. because of this high tariff. They were unable to sell their goods in the U.S., which means they couldn't make money, which means they couldn't pay us their debts back. And, of course, Europe retaliated with their own tariffs as well. You'll notice during the 20s, we're going to get a period here of high tariff rates, above 30%, 40%, eventually during the Depression into the 50s and 60%. And this is the message. This is a very famous tariff cartoon. This is a tariff wall, right? We're building a wall to protect ourselves from foreign competition. And the foreign guy who's trying to trade is saying, shut out. Meanwhile, the American businessman with all of his American products says, hey, we're shut in. Because when we create tariff walls against foreign countries, they do the same, which makes it harder for us to sell our products overseas in their countries too. So it's kind of double-edged sword. Yes, you're going to probably protect American businesses in the United States, but you're going to harm our ability to sell our products overseas. Remember, conservatives believe the federal government should be limited. It should stay out of the way of business. That's what laissez faire economics is. If they did get involved in business, they should do things to help businesses to grow. They shouldn't regulate them, which means obviously make them follow rules and regulations, which might cost money. Look the other way, allow them to have tax cuts or tax breaks. And a lot of times what happens is, what a conservative will do is, if there are government administrations like the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate the environment, and their job is to keep an eye on businesses to make sure they don't pollute, what a conservative will do is he'll put somebody in charge of that agency that doesn't believe in regulating the environment. So he'll intentionally not enforce the laws because he doesn't believe in them. In that way, you can still keep the agency without actually having it do anything to regulate businesses. They also, of course, allowed businesses to merge to form monopolies again in huge numbers. Antitrust laws that had been passed were not enforced by the Attorney General. They actually allowed businesses to set up trade associations where they could work with other businesses in their industries to cooperate, set prices, and also set production. Businessmen ran this government. It was a time when businessmen were seen as experts, as models for society, and they ought to run government like they ran their businesses efficiently, where one person or a handful of people made the decisions. Also, conservatives don't believe in any federal government programs to help people in need. For instance, they didn't believe in helping Mississippi flood victims, even though Hoover did what he could. They rejected plans to bring electricity and hydroelectric power to a lot of the South. They believed local communities and charities and friends and families and churches. That's who you turn to in times of need. You relied on yourself. You picked yourself up and you went out and you worked harder. You found a way to survive, and you relied on the people around you. You didn't go to your government. You didn't get federal assistance. You didn't get handouts from the government. Otherwise, they argued, conservatives did, that would make you more dependent on the government in the future. Conservatives dominated the Supreme Court. In just 3 years, Harding appointed 4 judges to the Supreme Court, to the 9-member court. It becomes incredibly conservative. What does it do? It starts to reverse a lot of the progressive policies of the 1920s. When we get into the New Deal of the 30s, it starts to overturn those as well, because it was conservative. Didn't believe the federal government had the authority or power to establish these massive programs that had given it more strength and control than ever before. They invalidated minimum wage laws. They invalidated work hour laws. Conservatives were harshly anti-union. They thought unions were bad for business because they caused workers to demand more things from the business, which hurt the business by causing it to lose money. They were shocked by all the strikes after World War I. They wanted harsh, brutal responses, and that's what they got. They blamed unions for these strikes. There was a huge drop in union membership. Remember, this is also the era where businesses started using welfare capitalism to give perks or benefits to their workers so they wouldn't join unions. The most huge strikes, railroad strike, was ended with major government action. So this was a time when government and business worked together to crush strikes and to reduce the influence of unions. They believed in reducing the national debt. They thought we had borrowed too much money, that we weren't paying it off, and that if we cut our debt and we made our government smaller, which meant that we spent less money each year, we could reduce that debt and we could start to get back to a zero balance again. Why were they worried about this? Because the national debt had gone from $1 billion to $24 billion during Wilson's presidency. A lot of that was the war. And so what do the conservatives do? They create something called the Bureau of the Budget. Its job was to reduce the debt, to get us back to where we were hopefully spending as much as we were making. We did reduce the debt under Andrew Mellon from $26 to $16 billion. A lot of that were for cuts. We cut programs that we had previously had, so that's going to make it harder for some Americans to get by without assistance from the government. Calvin Coolidge took over for Harding, and then he was reelected in 1924. He was a very moral, conservative guy. He was the perfect replacement for Harding, who had been a little kind of corrupt and maybe greedy. And so it was a choice designed to reaffirm America's trust in the Republican Party. Americans were so happy with the way the economy was booming. Even though there was incredible corruption in Harding's presidency, they went Republican overwhelmingly anyways. Coolidge is your next president. He ranks 26th on the list. And he went overwhelmingly. Again, the economy's roaring, so why wouldn't he? After all, people tend to vote for the president in charge when the economy is good. They vote against the president in charge when it's not doing so well. Coolidge really just carried out Harding's plans. Not a lot happened under him. The biggest issue was farmers. Farmers were just struggling mightily during this era. Farmers start to recover. They start to produce more. They can sell their goods in the U.S. That meant there was less demand for our products overseas. There's increased machine costs, increased machine production, I should say, which leads to lower prices. Because more farms have machines now, which means you have more crops and lower prices. All of these things are killing farming slowly, death by 1,000 cuts. Each year it gets worse and worse, and more farms close down. The Depression is going to devastate farms when it breaks out in the 1920s, and then, of course, the Great Depression is going to make matters worse. In fact, over 1 out of every 4 farms had to be sold or was closed down. There was an effort by Congress called the McNary-Haugen Bill to help farmers to control prices and maybe to try to drive up prices with a government policy. Unfortunately, the president didn't believe in government assistance, and so he vetoed it not once but twice. Again, 1920s conservative, you need to remember the tagline HALT. They believed in higher tariffs. They were anti-union. They believe in laissez, faire government. They believe in trickle-down, which is benefiting the wealthy by reducing their regulation and their taxes. Election of 1928, I told you, not a lot with Hoover. I'm sorry, not a lot with Coolidge. 1928, we get Herbert Hoover as our nominee. He promised, prosperity and prohibition. He was a moral reformer. He was conservative. He was popular. The Democrats nominated Al Smith. Now, here's the shocker. He's an Irish Catholic. He's the first Irish politician ever nominated. He was a machine politician from New York. Obviously, the fact that he's Irish, that he's an immigrant, that he's from a political machine, that he's from an American city, like New York. Rural Americans and the South just opposed him. They weren't going to vote for a Democrat. They weren't going to vote, I should say, for an Irishman, for an immigrant. And he was especially loud and boisterous and made kind of extreme claims. And so a lot of America was turned off by him. He was just too extreme. The radio was used for the first time in this campaign. Hoover warned of Al Smith, called him a socialist, argued we needed rugged individualism. We needed to rely on ourselves during this time. It had gotten us so far. After all, the economy was booming, and Hoover promised that with his policies, it would continue. A lot of religious discrimination against Smith. A lot of folks were unwilling to vote for Smith. In fact, we've only had one Catholic president. That was Kennedy. Other than that, we've had Protestant presidents exclusively. Look at how bad this was. Hoover defeated Smith 444 to 87. It was actually, in some of the Solid South, wouldn't vote for him. He was an Irishman, and so they refused, even though he was the Democrat, not to vote Democrat in that election. So I guess they were solidly South and solidly Democrat, unless it was, not a WASP, not a Protestant. If it was a Catholic Irish guy, then the South would be unwilling to vote for him. Anyways, it was a landslide for Hoover. He's the third straight Republican conservative president. There he is, 34th president who's in charge, technically, when the Great Crash and the Depression are going to hit. Speaking of it, Herbert Hoover's presidency, again, he had already had a reputation with the American public. He had a long past of doing kind of good work, not only during World War I with the Food Administration. Remember, he helped flood victims. He was a businessman. He hated socialism, and he thought government regulation could be out of control, but he did think that government and business could cooperate and work together and improve society. So he was a little bit of a progressive, even though he was still a businessman and supported business. He claimed in 1928 that poverty would be eliminated, it would be banished from this country. His campaign slogan was 2 chickens in every pot, so way more than we'll ever need is basically basically what he said if you vote for Hoover. And then, of course, everything comes to a halt. After the 20s, this incredible time of growth, of revolutionary spirit, of ideas, of money, of wealth, of all of these things, of technology, of inventions, one of the greatest decades in our life, and it all comes to a crashing halt when the stock market collapses in October of 1929. So, we know what the stock market is, right? It's a market where you can buy or sell shares of ownership in companies. So the biggest companies in the world are bought and sold on the stock market, and people like you and I, through a stock market investor or an investing agent, a stockbroker is what they're called. We can invest our money and buy portions of these companies, and if the value of the company goes up, we can make money on that company. If it goes down, well, we're a part owner. Obviously, we lose that money. Well, when the market is going up, when the economy is growing, and all businesses or most businesses tend to be expanding and growing and increasing in value, the market's charging forward. Those are good times in this country. That's called a bull market because the market is charging. When the economy struggles or the market goes down, it's called a bear market because we say the market's kind of hibernating, it's gone to sleep, and the value of stocks is going down as the economy goes down in this country. Anyways, the 1920s was a bull market. The stock market went up almost the entire decade. The value of companies continued to go up, 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 up. And what happened is more and more Americans invested in the stock market because it was seen as easy money. It was seen as something that was always going to continue to go up in value. A lot of Americans bought stock on what's called margin, which meant they bought it on credit. They put very little down for, like, let's say a $10 investment. They put $1 down and they borrowed $9 more. The idea of it was when they sold that stock, they would make a profit and they could pay the borrowed amount back. The assumption is you make a profit on the stock. If not, not only are you stuck with your $1 loss, but now you owe $9 on credit as well. And here's the other problem with the market. There was over-speculation. Investors, stockbrokers, were gambling that prices would continue to rise. That these economies, these industries would continue to grow, they would continue to produce, and we knew that there were certain industries that were starting to slow down, that were starting to experience problems by the end of the 1920s, that were not booming and growing like they had at the start of the 1920s. And so we have more money being pumped into these companies, more people expecting there to be a profit as the value of the company goes up, and the price and the share of these companies continues to rise because more and more money is being pumped into them, even though they were actually struggling to produce products and sell products around the world. And then it all crashed on October 29th, 1929. The stock market crashed. What that means is the value of all stocks on the market start to take a hit. They start to go down. And what happens is, as some companies' value starts to go down, as their value is lowered by stockbrokers, other companies that are around them start to feel the effects of that work with those companies, and their value starts to go down. And as the value of these stocks starts to go down, people start to sell off their ownership in the companies. And if enough people take their money out of the stock market at any given time, kind of like a bank, the market really struggles to pay all that money at once. That's called a crash. And that's what happened on Black Tuesday. A lot of folks believe the crash was the immediate cause of the Depression. There's no direct connection, but it's generally considered to be the unofficial start of the Great Depression, even though the effects of the Depression were not directly related to the crash. This was the panic on Wall Street on October 29th. These are regular folks who had invested their life savings in the stock market thinking it was a safe bet. They're locked out of the market. They're frantically trying to get in to talk to their stockbroker to try to tell him, sell what you can and get me as much of my money back as you can before the value of that company goes even lower and I lose even more of my money. People lost their savings. They lost millions in some instances. Most regular Americans just lost their savings, which was in the thousands. It was devastating to millions of people around the world. These crashes happen, but we're not normally as dependent on the market as people were at the end of the 20s because so many had invested in it. Anyways, I'm going to move forward here. This was the crash right here, October 29th, all in one day, well, in 1 month. Then it rose temporarily, and then look what happens as the depression rages on. It dropped almost back down to zero again, which means the value of most companies was essentially nothing. Long-term causes. Well, we had a lot of weak industries. I told you, even though more and more people believed the economy was going to continue to grow and continue to boom like it had in the early 20s, there were a number of key industries in this country that were struggling, that were suffering, that should have been warning signs to people that maybe you shouldn't invest. Instead, the stockbrokers convinced people to continue to put money in because they told people the market would just keep going up. The cotton industry and agriculture in general was struggling mightily, and cotton had been destroyed or really harmed by synthetics, not fake cotton, but other materials. And so since synthetic was being used for cheaper amounts, for cheaper prices, the cotton industry was unable to sell as much of its product. The railroad industry was devastated not only by the car but also the airplane, and so railroad companies were going to be devastated. A lot of them are going to go bankrupt. That's going to drag down all the money that's invested in them, and that's going to drag down all the other stocks that are on the stock market that are relying on them. The coal industry was hurt by electricity, by oil, by other chemicals. So the coal industry is harmed. Iron is destroyed by steel, or is not destroyed by it, but is really harmed by it. Again, there were low food prices. Agriculture is devastated. So again, we have all of these key industries that were actually starting to flatline, to suffer, to no longer gain like they had in the early 20s. But people blindly just continue to pump money into them, assuming they would somehow figure it out. Instead, the crash happened. The biggest issues we have are overproduction of goods. We have way too many goods being produced, way more than our population could use. There's underconsumption. Americans start to save money. They don't want to spend it. They're worried about the future when the crash happens. So we have even more goods that pile up. That obviously causes prices across this country to be driven down. People will not buy these goods. They're nervous. Consumers and farmers had already exhausted their credit. The banks wouldn't give them any more by this point. And so a lot of the 1920s growth is kind of fake growth. It's predicated on borrowed money, on credit. And eventually by the end of the decade, they're not letting you borrow any more money anymore because you borrowed all you could. And you're really unable to pay it back. And that's when the economy kind of just collapses. It's like a house of cards, the economy is. So it's a great booming time, but a lot of it is kind of inauthentic. It's kind of fake growth. It's a lot like our 2008 crisis with the banks. Same thing, where the banks gave out all these crazy loans to homeowners who probably couldn't afford the homes, and then all those homes ended up being repossessed, and it really destroyed the banking and housing industry. Anyways, we overproduced goods. We couldn't consume what we were making, so stockpiles, way too much demand, which drives prices down. Remember, we cut population in the 20s, which means we have even less consumers than before. Warehouses of products that are not being sold, but are filled to the brim. We have an uneven distribution of wealth, so 5% of the population has 30% of all of the money. Over half of this country lives underneath the poverty line. They're considered poor. They don't have any money. They can't get credit anymore. So we're in bad shape deep down inside, underneath, when you peel away the layers. There was a horrible banking system in place. The Fed was okay. It just needed reform. It needed to be fixed. It was being taken advantage of by bankers and stock market officials. It was mismanaged. There was too much speculation in banks, in companies, where they were valued at more than they were actually worth. And 1% of the banks controlled over half of all banking money. That's too much power in the hands of too few banks. This meant that smaller banks, medium-sized banks, oftentimes didn't have a lot of resources or wealth to survive crashes or panics. And so when a run took place, banks shut down and closed by the hundreds, eventually by the thousands. Here's American Union Bank in New York City experiencing a run. People are frantically trying to get in to take their money out while the bank still had money. Remember, there was nothing in place to save you if you didn't get your money out. There was a weak international economy as well, so it's not just problems in the United States. Our tariffs, our protectionism as it's called, our tariffs hurt trade with foreign countries. We remember not only passed the ridiculously high 40 McCumber, we then passed our all-time highest tariff, the Hawley Smoot, during the Depression. It raised tariff levels above 50%. We had 23 different countries pass tariffs against us in response. Overall, we could not really trade with the rest of the world to help our own economy. In addition to that, as time went by, Europe was unable to, because they couldn't trade with us because of our tariffs. They were unable to pay us back our loans, and that caused the economic crisis in the U.S. to get worse. This, my friends, is where we will stop it, and we will pick this up in class on Monday. Until then, it's Mr. M signing off.